On a quiet Sunday morning in 1991, 47 people walked into a small church in rural Georgia expecting salvation. By nightfall, 12 of them would be fighting for their lives in the emergency room, and one elderly woman would be dead. The weapon, something you'd never suspect, was hiding in plain sight, right there in the communion cup. Today, I'm taking you deep into one of the most disturbing cases of mass poisoning in American religious history. We'll uncover how a trusted member of a tight-knit congregation turned a sacred ritual into a nightmare, the shocking motive that drove them to do it, and the brilliant detective work that finally exposed the truth. This is a story about betrayal, desperation, and how evil can hide behind the most innocent face. Stick with me until the end, because the twist in this case will leave you absolutely speechless. Let me set the scene for you. It's September 15, 1991, in the small town of Douglas, Georgia. Population barely 11,000. The Morning Star Baptist Church sits at the end of a red dirt road, a modest white building with a crooked steeple and paint peeling from the Georgia heat. This church isn't just a place of worship. It's the beating heart of this community. Everyone knows everyone. Families have been attending services here for generations. That Sunday started like any other. Pastor William Green stood at the pulpit, his booming voice echoing off the wooden walls as he delivered his sermon about forgiveness and redemption. In the front pew sat 68-year-old Martha Henderson, a woman who hadn't missed a Sunday service in 32 years. Behind her, the Tompkins family, mother, father, and 3 young children, sang hymns with their hands clasped together. Scattered throughout the small sanctuary were about 40 other souls, all dressed in their Sunday best. Then came the moment that would change everything. Communion. The church deacon, 52-year-old Vernon Davis, began preparing the sacrament. Vernon was a fixture at Morning Star Baptist. He'd been a deacon for 15 years, managed the church finances, and was known for his gentle demeanor and his willingness to help anyone in need. Nobody would have ever suspected Vernon Davis of anything sinister. He was practically a saint in their eyes. Vernon carefully filled the small plastic communion cups with grape juice, placing them methodically on the silver tray. The congregation watched with reverence as he moved through his familiar routine. But what they didn't know, what they couldn't have possibly known, was that Vernon had made a stop at the supply closet before the service. And in that closet, he'd done something unthinkable. As the communion tray made its way down the rows, people lifted the tiny cups to their lips and drank. Within minutes, the first person began to feel it. Sarah Tompkins, age 34, was the first to notice something was wrong. She later told investigators that within seconds of swallowing the communion juice, she felt an intense burning sensation in her throat. It wasn't like anything she'd experienced before, not like acid reflux or spicy food. This was different, chemical. Well, she looked over at her husband, Marcus, who had gone pale. His hand was clutched to his chest, and sweat was already beading on his forehead. "Marcus," she whispered, but he couldn't respond. He was too busy trying to breathe. Then Martha Henderson, the elderly woman in the front row, let out a strangled gasp and slumped forward. Her communion cup clattered to the floor, grape juice staining the worn carpet. That's when the chaos erupted. People started dropping like flies. Some collapsed in their pews. Others stumbled into the aisles, clutching their throats, their faces turning disturbing shades of red and purple. Children were screaming. Pastor Green abandoned his sermon and rushed to help, but he didn't know what he was dealing with. Nobody did. "Call 911," someone shouted, and 3 people scrambled for the church phone. Vernon Davis, the deacon who had prepared the communion, stood frozen at the front of the church. Later, witnesses would recall the expression on his face. Not shock, not horror, but something else entirely. Something calculating. But in the moment, everyone was too panicked to notice. Within 12 minutes, the first ambulance arrived. Then another. And another. By the time the scene was secured, There were 6 ambulances, 2 fire trucks, and every available officer from the Douglas Police Department crowding the church parking lot. EMTs rushed inside to find a scene that looked like something from a disaster movie. Bodies were sprawled across pews. People were vomiting. Some had lost consciousness entirely. The air was thick with the smell of sickness and fear. "We need to know what they ingested," one of the paramedics shouted to Pastor Green. "Just communion juice," the pastor replied, bewildered. "Just grape juice from the kitchen." But it clearly wasn't just grape juice. The victims were rushed to Coffee Regional Medical Center, where the emergency room was immediately overwhelmed. Doctors had no idea what they were treating. Was it food poisoning? Some kind of biological attack? The symptoms didn't match anything in their standard protocols. People were experiencing severe gastrointestinal distress, difficulty breathing, rapid heart rates, and in the worst cases, cardiac arrhythmias. One doctor, Dr. Patricia Hernandez, made the call that likely saved lives. "Treat them for poisoning," she ordered. "Activated charcoal, 4 fluids, and get toxicology on the phone now." While doctors fought to save lives, Detective James Morrison of the Douglas Police Department was already at the church, treating it like the crime scene it was. Because by now, everyone understood the truth. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately poisoned the communion. Detective Morrison was a 20-year veteran with a reputation for being thorough, almost obsessively so. He'd worked his share of murders, robberies, and assaults, but nothing had prepared him for this. Poisoning a church during communion. It was beyond evil, it was sacrilege. He immediately secured the remaining communion cups, the grape juice container from the kitchen, and every bottle, jar, and container in the church supply closet. Everything was bagged, tagged, and sent to the Georgia Bureau of Investigation Crime Lab for analysis. Then came the interviews. One by one, Detective Morrison sat down with church members who hadn't taken communion, the ones who'd been spared purely by chance. And one name kept coming up in those conversations: Vernon Davis. Here's what Detective Morrison learned. Vernon Davis wasn't the saint everyone thought he was. For the past 3 years, Vernon had been managing the church finances. It was a position of tremendous trust in a small congregation where every dollar mattered. The church was saving for a new roof. They'd been collecting donations for months, storing the money in an account that Vernon controlled. But there was a problem. That money. It was gone. Vernon Davis had been systematically stealing from the church for nearly 2 years. Small amounts at first. $50 here, $100 there. Nothing that would raise immediate red flags. But as his personal debts mounted, gambling debts, as investigators would later discover, the amounts grew larger. By September 1991, Vernon had embezzled over $47,000 from Morning Star Baptist Church. And people were starting to ask questions. 2 weeks before that fateful Sunday, the church board had voted to conduct an audit of the finances. Vernon had smiled and nodded and assured everyone that the books were in perfect order. But he knew the truth. He knew that the moment they looked at those accounts, his life was over. He'd lose everything: his reputation, his freedom, probably his marriage. So Vernon Davis made a decision. A horrifying, desperate decision. In Vernon's mind, the solution was terrifyingly simple. If he couldn't face the audit, he'd make sure the audit never happened. And the people pushing hardest for that audit, they'd be at church on Sunday. They'd take communion. Detective Morrison later found Vernon's journal, hidden in a tackle box in his garage. The entries from the weeks leading up to the poisoning revealed a man spiraling into darkness, trying to justify the unjustifiable. One entry read, "They're going to take everything from me. After all I've done for that church, after all the years I've given them, Martha Henderson treats me like a criminal already. She looks at me with those suspicious eyes. Maybe if she wasn't around to push this audit, Maybe the others would forget about it. Maybe I could fix this. Another entry, dated just 3 days before the poisoning. I've made my decision. God forgive me, but I see no other way. But Vernon's plan had a fatal flaw. Fatal for his victims and ultimately for him. He wasn't a chemist or a doctor. He didn't understand dosages or toxicology. He didn't realize that poisoning isn't as precise as it looks in the movies. The toxicology reports came back 48 hours after the incident, and they confirmed what Dr. Hernandez had suspected. The communion juice had been laced with arsenic trioxide, a powerful and historically infamous poison. Where did Vernon get it? From the church itself. Morning Star Baptist Church, like many rural churches built decades ago, had a serious ant problem. Stored in the supply closet, on a high shelf that most people never looked at, was an old tin of ant poison containing arsenic trioxide. It had been there for years, probably forgotten by whoever originally bought it. But Vernon remembered it. The morning of September 15th, Vernon arrived at the church 2 hours before service. He unlocked the supply closet, found the tin, and carefully measured out what he thought would be a non-lethal dose. His plan, according to his journal, was to make people sick enough that they'd cancel the audit and focus on the crisis at the church. He specifically wanted to target Martha Henderson, the 68-year-old who'd been the loudest voice calling for financial transparency. But Vernon made a critical miscalculation. Arsenic trioxide doesn't distribute evenly in liquid clumps. Some communion cups ended up with barely any poison. Others, like the one Martha Henderson drank, contained a concentrated dose that was immediately lethal. On September 18th, 3 days after the poisoning, Detective Morrison knocked on Vernon Davis's door. Vernon answered wearing a bathrobe, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. He looked like he hadn't slept in days. Because he hadn't. "Vernon, we need to talk," Detective Morrison said. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "I know," Vernon replied. Just 2 words. But they carried the weight of absolute defeat. At the station, Vernon initially tried to maintain his innocence. "Why would I hurt those people? They're my family. That church is my life." But Detective Morrison had done his homework. He laid out the evidence piece by piece. The embezzlement, the journal entries, Vernon's fingerprints on the tin of ant poison, which they'd found pushed to the back of the supply closet shelf, and the testimony of a church member who'd seen Vernon in the supply closet that morning before service. "We also found arsenic residue under your fingernails, Vernon," Detective Morrison said quietly. "The forensics team was very thorough." That's when Vernon broke. He put his head in his hands and began to sob, deep, wrenching sobs that shook his entire body. "I didn't mean for anyone to die," he choked out. "I just wanted them to get sick. I just wanted more time. That's all I wanted. More time to fix the money situation. Martha Henderson didn't get more time, Vernon. She died. And 12 other people are still in the hospital. 3 of them might not make it." Detective Morrison's voice was hard now, anger finally breaking through his professional demeanor. "You poison people during communion. Do you understand how sick that is?" Vernon looked up, his face twisted with anguish and something that might have been genuine remorse. Or maybe it was just self-pity. "I know," he whispered. "God help me, I know what I've done. Martha Henderson died the day after the poisoning. Her heart, already weakened by age, couldn't handle the assault of the arsenic. She passed away with her daughter holding her hand, never knowing why someone would want to hurt her. Of the other 12 critically poisoned victims, 2 more died over the following week. Marcus Tompkins, the 39-year-old father of 3, and 62-year-old James Walsh, a retired postal worker. The others survived, but many were left with permanent organ damage. Scarred kidneys, liver problems, and in some cases, neurological issues that would plague them for the rest of their lives. The children who drank the communion that day were traumatized in ways that couldn't be measured in hospital charts. Sarah Tompkins, who lost her husband Marcus, later testified that her youngest daughter wouldn't drink anything from a cup for 2 years afterward. The girl would only drink from clear bottles where she could see exactly what was inside. Vernon Davis was charged with 3 counts of murder, 12 counts of attempted murder, and numerous counts of assault and reckless endangerment. His trial began in April 1992, and the whole town showed up. The courtroom was packed every single day. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case. The evidence was ironclad. The journal entries, the forensics, the embezzlement records, the testimony of surviving victims. Vernon's defense attorney tried to argue temporary insanity, painting his client as a desperate man who'd had a mental breakdown. But the prosecution countered with the journal entries that showed clear premeditation. Vernon had been planning this for weeks. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts. When the judge asked Vernon if he had anything to say before sentencing, Vernon stood slowly. He looked out at the packed courtroom, at the faces of the people he'd known for years, the people he'd worshipped beside, the people he'd tried to kill. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't deserve it. I let fear and pride turn me into a monster. I took the lives of good people. I destroyed families. I desecrated the house of God." His voice broke. "I will carry this guilt until the day I die, and probably beyond. Sorry. I know it means nothing, but I'm so sorry." Several people in the courtroom were crying. Not for Vernon, for what had been lost. For the innocence of their small community. For the sacred space that had been violated. For Martha, Marcus, and James, who would never see another sunrise. The judge showed no mercy. Vernon Davis was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, plus an additional 120 years for the attempted murders and assaults. He would die in prison. As Vernon was led away in chains, someone in the gallery shouted, "I hope you rot in hell." The bailiff called for order, but Vernon didn't react. He just kept walking, his head down, a broken man shuffling toward his eternity. Vernon Davis is currently serving his sentence at Georgia State Prison. He's 85 years old now, having spent over 3 decades behind bars. In various interviews over the years, he's maintained that he thinks about his victims every single day. Whether that's genuine remorse or just the words of a man trying to find meaning in his wasted life, we'll never know. Morning Star Baptist Church still stands on that red dirt road in Douglas, Georgia. After the poisoning, attendance dropped dramatically. Many members couldn't bring themselves to return to the building where they'd almost died. The church nearly closed in 1993, but a core group of dedicated members fought to keep it alive. They saw shutting down as letting Vernon win, as allowing evil to triumph over faith. Today, the church has a new pastor and a modest but devoted congregation. They've implemented strict protocols for communion. Everything is prepared in full view of the congregation now, with multiple people involved in the process. Trust, once shattered, had to be rebuilt piece by piece. Sarah Tompkins, who lost her husband Marcus, eventually remarried and moved to Atlanta with her children. In a 2015 interview, she said, "For years I was so angry. Angry at Vernon, angry at God, angry at the world. But I realized that anger was poisoning me just as surely as that arsenic poisoned us. I had to let it go. Not for Vernon's sake, for mine. For my kids." The families of Martha Henderson and James Walsh established a foundation that provides support to victims of violent crime in rural communities. It's their way of transforming tragedy into something meaningful, of ensuring their loved ones' deaths weren't completely in vain. The Morning Star Baptist Church poisoning remains one of the most shocking cases of mass poisoning in American religious history. It's a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it wears a friendly face. Sometimes it sits in the front pew. Vernon Davis was described by everyone who knew him as kind, gentle, and trustworthy right up until the moment he wasn't. His case is studied in criminal psychology courses as an example of how seemingly ordinary people can commit extraordinary acts of violence when backed into a corner by their own poor choices. But perhaps the most haunting aspect of this story is how preventable it was. If Vernon had simply confessed to the embezzlement when the questions first started, he'd have faced serious consequences, maybe even prison time, but nothing like what he's facing now. His desperation to avoid exposure led him to commit acts far worse than anything he was originally trying to hide. It's a lesson about the danger of covering up mistakes, about how one bad choice can spiral into catastrophe if we're not careful. Vernon Davis started by stealing $50. He ended up as a triple murderer. The communion cups from that September morning are stored in evidence at the Georgia Bureau of Investigation. Small plastic cups, innocuous and ordinary, that became instruments of murder. Sometimes I think about those cups, about how something designed for such a sacred purpose could be perverted into something so evil. But I also think about the survivors, the people who chose to rebuild their church, their community, their faith. The ones who refused to let one man's heinous act define them. That's the real story here. Not just the darkness Vernon brought, but the light that pushed back against it. Evil is real. This case proves it. But so is resilience. So is redemption. So is the human capacity to survive the unsurvivable and find meaning in the aftermath. If you found this story as compelling and disturbing as I did, please consider subscribing to this channel. I dive deep into true crime cases that deserve more attention, stories of mystery, investigation, and the dark corners of human nature. Hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you never miss a video. Your support helps me continue bringing you these thoroughly researched stories. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next case.